Hello fellow crafters, I'm Karen, and in this video I'll be working on my first building for my winter fairy garden, which is the bookstore. In this part 1 video, I'll be working on the general structure of the building. There are a few stages we're going to go through in this part 1 video to build the macro structure for this bookstore. The design that I have in mind is to build it as an underground sort of structure built into the roots of a tree, which I'm only going to use the tree stump. The materials and tools that you'll need are up on the screen, and these will take you through part 1 but not part 2 of this craft. The materials have to do with 4 stages in this part of the craft. First, we're going to work with some plastic containers, and I'm going to be using sour cream containers of various sizes to build the interior rooms of the bookstore. The wire then will be used to form the trunk of the tree, and we'll use clay to round out the wire into what looks more like roots. Then you'll need materials to work on the front facade of the building, followed lastly by the base for the entire structure, which in my case is going to be 1/4-inch plywood. In this overall structure, the primary shape is really going to come from the tree and the roots, so I have to kind of keep that in mind as I do all of the other steps. The base comes in at the beginning, even though I won't be actually attaching things to it or cutting it to size until later on. The reason is that I need to make sure I stay within the confines of this actual board so that I don't run out of space later on. So my intention is to set up like this with the main room, and I'm going to cut the bottom edge off of these, and then a sort of side room off of that, but with the same front face, and then the tree will come up here, and then we'll have this one over here just to sort of ease the roots down to ground level. My first step then is to cut these down to size, which is going to be cutting off the edges so they have a flat edge. I'm just going to be using regular scissors for this. And it doesn't really matter which part of the container I use, although I'm going to probably take advantage of some of the printed lines on here to help me cut straight. So we got to start somewhere. And it doesn't have to be perfect, because this is really going to be pretty hidden in the end. So that gives me one flat edge. And you'll determine the height of your building by where you cut it on the other edge. So if I cut lower, it's going to make for a taller building. If I cut higher, it's going to make for a shorter building. I want to leave enough room that I can do things inside, like put in interior decorations, but I don't want to leave so much that there's a lot to decorate inside. So I'm going to actually go right here, which conveniently lines up with this other red line. And then you just want to make a straight line between your 2 cuts, which you can use a straight edge for to mark if you would like, or you can just sort of eyeball it like I am. Not bad. There's part 1. I'm going to go ahead and do the same process for these other 2 to get them ready. I've done one thing different with the third container that I did not do with the first 2. So for the first 2, I cut straight up and down for the most part. It looks like just a partial container here. With the third one, I cut a different shape. It looks like this. From the sides, you can see that at the top edge of the container, there's a smaller distance than at the bottom edge. And the reason I did this is just to get it to angle upward. At this point, I want to sort of fine-tune this so that it's exactly the shape that I want. What I'm imagining is the tree comes up here like this, and then has a stump. So I'll probably have to build up a little bit on this larger container to get my roots to look right. So it'll just be a question of, I want this container to open up into this one. So I'm going to need to do some cutting along here. So I just drew in a rough shape of where I want to cut out. And I'm trying to imagine that if this container over here were to flatten out and meet this one, where they would sort of intersect. I may have to build in some sort of little roof basically in there later. And I'm just going to come along sort of straight down this back curve. And then we'll see if we can take a little bit away from this one maybe. So they go together. And lastly, I plan to have a bit of an access door in the back of this medium container, which will allow me to get in to the lights later on. The trick here is not destroying too much of the support that's keeping this upright. Because this is the edge that's keeping it upright right now. So I can't cut that out entirely. I think I'm going to take it out of this side over here, leaving a little bit of a ridge to help with the rigidity. But coming up enough that I'll be able to get my fingers in later. The goal here is really just to combine these two pieces enough that they won't move around too much later. That way I can form everything around it without them moving. You can use the hot glue to build up a little bit on itself if you need to add height in this spot. I expect this next part is going to be the most challenging and one of the most time-consuming parts of this process, and that is to turn this 16 gauge wire into a tree. And I have a vague concept of how I want this to turn out, but I am not 100% sure how I'm going to make it happen. And fortunately, the wire is not going to be the final product. I'm going to be using clay to sort of round things out, so there's a little bit of forgiveness there, but I do want to have the general structure right without doing too much extra work. The biggest thing to keep in mind at this point in the process is that somehow this is going to need to attach itself to your base in the end. You could use glue, but my plan is to actually screw in from the bottom into a block of wood on the top with the wire. I'll be making some loops sort of cinched in between the two. So I need to plan that in, and I think that's really all the planning that I need to do at this point in time. I also have some wire mesh that I'll be using to wrap around the trunk so that I don't have to do that all with wire. I can just sort of build up some posts and then coil wire mesh around that. That'll also help to hold the clay in place. So if you have any areas, if you're doing this at home, where there's going to be a lot of surface area that's just flat or even like curved like a trunk, it's okay to use some wire mesh there so that you don't have to try and do it with your thin wire. I've been thinking about whether to do this as a single piece of really long wire that's bent all over the place or a bunch of shorter wires. I think for the sake of bending it and manipulating it, a bunch of shorter wires are going to actually be easier. So what I'm going to do is make sort of a ring that'll be the bottom of the trunk, and it's going to have little loops basically where I can just wrap the individual roots into that circle, and then I can just do as many roots as I want to. Okay, so I think I'm going to call it quits on the wire for now. Just a couple of quick comments on that. It's funny because it feels like it's a little bit fragile, even though it's wire and it's bendable and you can keep moving it wherever you need it. But you get something in the place where you kind of want it and you don't want it to move anymore. But you just have to keep in mind that you can always move things. It's wire, it'll bend, you can sort of bend it all over. But you do want to be thinking as you go about how you're going to connect all the pieces to one another. I did like having this little circle with the hoops on it. It allowed me to use a bunch of different pieces with the wire as I was going. I did try to build up the outside of the trunk. You want to use enough pieces of wire around the outside. I used 6 so that you can wrap something around it without losing the shape too much. You want it to look roughly round-ish, but as we know, trees are not always like perfectly round at the base. You just don't want to have like maybe 3 wires and end up with it looking sort of triangular. I also ran 1 piece of wire across the top just to help support the wire mesh that I'll put on the top. And then I just wanted to note that you'll want to, in some places, like this one's a good example here, bend the wire, bend it back on itself, and then go out again. And you can do that multiple times. When we do add the clay, it will allow it to fork in multiple places, which will make it look a little bit more natural than if you just have long roots that cover the distance but don't split at all. I took a little break after working the wire because it hurts my hands a little bit, and I wanted to be nice and ready to work on the clay. So the first thing that we need to get done right now is to add the wire mesh around the trunk, and that will provide a little bit of extra support for the clay that needs to be there since it's mostly going to be pretty much vertical. So I pre-worked some of my clay, but before we do that, we can work with this wire mesh. And I just bought this at the craft store. It's aluminum and evidently a little bit mean. And it can just be cut with regular scissors, so I pulled out some heavier duty scissors than my normal. And this is designed for working in things like this where you're trying to support clay. It's surprisingly stiff. And very prickly along the edges. So if you do this, be careful. You may even want to use gloves. Okay. So I'm not going to be super precise with measuring here. Just going to kind of get an idea for how tall it is. And I have some other wire that I can use to help attach it. I'm going to go about there. It does cut pretty easily. These are actually kitchen scissors. And what we want to do is end up with enough to wrap around the trunk, which is about 3 inches in diameter, so I need about 9 inches for the circumference. Just another inch or so there. But I'm going to give a little extra because I'd rather have more than less. I've never worked with this stuff before because I haven't done actually much clay work in the past. So I'm going to try to straighten this a little bit and then wrap it around the trunk. It's a little tall, but I think what I'm going to do is take advantage of that and let it start forming the downward direction on some of these bigger roots. So I'm going to attach it on the one side with some of this 22 gauge wire and then cut it a little bit as I go. Okay, I'd say that did the job, and you'll note that I put a square of wire mesh on the top instead of doing a circle. I didn't find that there's any need to be so precise as to do a circle, and the square corners then fold around the edges, which provides a little continuity. So all I did during that process was twist wire around to try and hold it in place roughly. It doesn't have to be perfect, and then I cut up the bottom edges just a little bit whenever it got too tight to deal with the flaring out roots. So now I can take some of the clay that I have already worked, and I'm just using white Sculpey oven baked clay. I picked the oven bake because I was reading that air dry clay has a tendency to dry and crack, and oven baked clay doesn't do that. And I didn't want to deal with the cracking so much in a new type of medium. So I went with the oven-baked clay, which does mean that it was necessary for me to make sure that these plastic containers were removable, because were I to put those in the oven, I'm sure they would start melting. So at this point, it's just going to be a matter of forming clay around the entire wire structure. So on the top here, which I might actually use this piece for, I'm going to try to thin out a nice little round piece of clay and just place it on top there. I may build up the edges a little bit to make it look a little bit more like it kind of broke or rotted off or something like that. I haven't worked out all of the plan yet. I'll do a lot of that as I go, and I don't want to make it too thick, so I'm working, this is probably 1/4 inch or less for most of this piece right now, because the baking time increases the thicker your clay is. So this is pretty close. You don't want to go too thin because you don't want it to break at any point, but since this will be supported by the wire, I can go a little bit thinner on this. And it does leave a slight residue, so I will switch here to working on what's actually a cake board, just so I can have a flat surface that I can make a mess of. I want to share a few principles to follow while you're forming your clay. So you want to work from the largest to the smallest roots. If you start with too many small roots, you may not have room for the larger ones, and you do want to have a variety so that they all look like they belong. You also want to make sure that as you go, you're keeping an eye on the balance of the overall structure. So if you have too many large roots on one side and the whole structure starts to tip, you may have to put in a support or make a change so that you're putting some large roots opposite so that the whole thing stays balanced. From an artistic side of things, you want it to look a little bit knobbly. So you want to add clay or mold the clay in such a manner as to create bumps. You don't want it to look like a whole bunch of tubes, because it won't look natural. Trees are very bumpy by nature. They form in the manner that they grow, so you don't have perfect cylinders in your roots or even in your trunk. You'll also, speaking of the trunk, want to add some ridges down the side. So where the roots start to form and jut out from the overall trunk, if you create some ridges there, that helps to create some of the overall shape. Again, a perfect cylinder is not going to look exactly right. And then lastly, you want to think about how many roots you want to have. It's not necessary to go down to the really fine hair-like roots that you would find on many types of real trees. We just want to create the image of variety. So you want to have some large roots for sure, some medium roots, some small roots, but you really don't have to have tons and tons of variety. You just want to have enough to make it look realistic. If you're trying to take every large root and do multiple forks to medium roots and have each of those medium roots fork off to smaller roots and so on and so forth, it's not going to be very easy to do the whole project, and you'll have kind of a cluttered root mess in the end. And actually, if you look at pictures of real trees, it looks kind of messy because that's how they grow. But for this, you want to keep it actually more simple. Okay, so I've got the bulk clay structure done here, and the next step is going to be just to kind of smooth out all of the features just by rubbing my thumb or another finger down along the seams so it doesn't look so much like I just put a whole bunch of pieces together in a patchwork sort of way. This doesn't have to be super detailed, but I want to get rid of the sort of larger areas where it doesn't look very cohesive yet. Alright, so with the surfaces smoothed off, now we actually want to add a little bit of texture in there. So you can put some indents in different places, or I'm going to be trying some ace bandage and just see if that'll add some of that like crinkly texture to especially the trunk to make it look a little bit more like bark. But you're kind of distressing the clay, and then you can go ahead and bake it. That's not very effective. It's just putting itty bitty little dents in there. So I definitely recommend a knife as the means of doing that step. It makes sense to just kind of draw in these little ridges. One really important thing that I learned during this is that it really helps to draw in some extra thick ridges, so a deeper ridge with your knife, and it provides depth to the whole thing. So really dig into it sometimes, and that makes it look a lot more authentically like a tree. So the next step for me is really just going to be baking this in the oven. It's supposed to be at 275 degrees and 15 minutes per 1/4 inch. Now I've got some areas that are quite a bit thicker. I'm not worried about burning the surface a tad. Sometimes it'll brown a little, but I'm not going to worry about that simply because I really want this to bake all the way through. I've got some things cracking here a little bit. I'm not sure if that's a temperature thing or air dryness maybe. But anyways, I'm going to try probably 30 minutes at first and then add a little time if it feels a little insecure. So this is the final baked version of my tree stump. I'm quite happy with how it turned out. The texture held very well, and so we have some of these deeper ridges through here. I didn't have any issues in baking it. I did bake it on the glass jar, but now that I have taken the glass jar out, it's okay. I don't need to use that anymore as a support. So I've placed my sour cream containers back in, and there is one modification that I want to make here before I move on to making the front face of the actual building. Basically, I want to be able to look sort of down into the building as opposed to straight across into the building, mostly because the center point of the whole structure, because of the height of the trunk, is sort of more up here. So I need to be able to look down as opposed to just straight in to see the insides of the building. So all I'm going to do to make that happen is cut this container at a bit more of an angle so that it's taller at the front. So the front's not going to change, but it's going to become shorter at the back. And I'll do that on both containers to make them level, and then we can go ahead and proceed to make what will be the front face of this. So the next step is to create the front facade of the building. Now, I had pre-drawn my sketch, and I want to go with, for lack of a better word, sort of a medieval style front. So I found these. I'm not sure if I'll be able to use them or if they'll look too large, but they're called decorative rings, but they look like fancy little doorknobs, and they're brass. And then I found actually at a hardware store. And then I found these actually, they're brads, and they are 3 different sort of colors. So you got like a silvery one. Actually, there's 4. There's a silvery, a gold, a brass, and like a nickel kind of look. So I hope to be able to make use of some of those. But the primary structure is going to be held together most likely pretty much by hot glue. I'm going to be doing the base of it in cardboard, and then covering it with, well, I have some choices to make. I think I'll probably paint the cardboard background, but then build up some foam to look like the trim and things like that. And then I have some plastic here somewhere to use as windows, and this is a thing oddly come by, which is that my mother-in-law had accidentally fused together some plastic wrap. So this is actually like a really thick layer of many layers of plastic wrap, which created a kind of, I don't even know how to describe it. It's almost, it got like lines through it, but not quite. It looks kind of just like a textured glass. So I nabbed a piece of that to use, and that'll be my windows. While I've got my hot glue gun heating up, the first step is going to be to trace the outline of this front shape. It's going to be a little bit tricky because if you look at it straight on, you can see that the front faces are not a straight line. So to show it this way, if I were to draw a straight line from this container, it hits over here. So I either have to sort of bend the cardboard to fit the shape, or go at an angle that sort of covers both and fill in that space. And I think I'd actually prefer to sort of bend it a little bit at the midpoint. I think it'll add to the whimsical nature of fairy garden buildings. So I'll give that a shot. So to achieve that, I think I'm going to let this hang off the edge so I can get a true tracing, if I can think this through. And then, of course, that is not the exact right dimensions because that's inside the opening. So we want to leave enough extra outside of that that we can attach it, enough to glue basically, and enough room for error. So I'm going to give probably another, at least a gluing margin over here because I went pretty close to the edge, but then widen out to a little more than a gluing margin. So you could draw this on if you wanted to, or just cut it. And now we need to cut out that design. So there's the general idea. And when we hit this center point here, that's where the two containers intersect. So I'm going to kind of eyeball that spot. Actually, I might mark it. And then we want to make a fold line. And then this whole side is going to have a bit of a curve to it. So I'm just going to kind of gently curve that into the cardboard. So now, keeping in mind this outline of the interior opening that I have, I can sketch on the windows and doors that I had planned, and then cut out the holes for the windows, and we'll attach the window pane glass. With the outline of the windows and door drawn, I now need to cut out the windows, and I've decided that I don't want the door to actually be functional since I've left an access door in the back. So the door doesn't need to be cut at all. I'll just use that outline for the foam boards that I'm adding on top. But the windows need to be cut out, and since it's fairly small cutouts that I'll need to do, I'll be using an X-Acto knife. And I recommend using a cutting board underneath just so you protect whatever surface you're cutting on. So we'll do that, and then we can add the window panes. To cut out the window panes from this piece of plastic, I'm actually going to use the pieces that I cut out from the windows and trace those onto this plastic. Now remember, it needs to be wider than your opening so that there's a place to glue it from the back. So I'm going to trace them as is and then cut them a little bit wider. So the windows will go in here later, but the next step that I actually want to do is the rest of the front of it, since it's going to involve painting, and I don't want to accidentally paint on my windows, just like you wouldn't want to do that in real life. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out the foam, which I'm going to use to provide some depth to the wall. This will act as like trim around the doors and windows. So for this I'm just going to use craft foam, and since overall I'm going to have the facade be painted kind of brown, I'm going to use brown foam just so that the paint, if it shows through the paint at all, it won't be an issue because it's also brown. To avoid any left-right inconsistency or asymmetry in my window drawings, I'm actually going to trace this upside down so that when I mark the foam, those markings can be on the back side of the foam, and then when those are on the back side, it'll actually be the right orientation, left to right, of the windows. For the windows, I tried to leave about a 1/4 inch margin, a wide 1/4 inch, erring on the side of 3/8. In this case, I want to err on the side of about 1/8 of an inch for my trim, and I just don't want it to look too thick on the windows, especially since I need to have multiple window frames close to each other. These, of course, will also need the centers cut out, which is the easiest for the door because it's not enclosed. So I'll do the door first and then go back to the cutting board for the windows. Okay, so now we've got the depth added to this by cutting out those pieces of foam. And one comment about that is that I always cut about halfway through on the first time through, and I'm aiming for precision. So I want to match my lines the first time through without worrying about cutting all the way through. And then I go around a second time to finish the cut when I can follow the guideline of the first cut that I've already done. So with that complete, I'm going to be gluing these foam pieces on very carefully and then painting the background. So I actually kind of have to decide if I want to do that background painting first. I think that actually makes more sense. So flip that around. I'm going to do the background painting, and then I'll glue the foam pieces on, and then we can add the window pieces. So I think it was definitely a good choice to add that extra layer of darker brown. It definitely adds some extra depth to the whole thing. It makes it look a little bit more distinct. So the next step is going to be the windows. And one thing that I have wanted to do with this is to make little grills that go across them. And I've been sort of toying with how to do it, and I landed at doing it with wire. So what I want to do is sort of a crosshatch pattern. So I'm going to need to be cutting little pieces of wire, and they'll be glued in place in that pattern, but to the back of the windows. And then I'll slap the plastic on the back of that, and it should theoretically look like the grill sits on top of the window. So I'm going to have to cut a bunch of pieces of wire here that I can get as straight as possible. Starting with a coil of wire makes this a little bit tricky. But this is the same 22 gauge wire that I used to secure some of the pieces in the trunk of the wire mesh. So I'm just going to be cutting pieces and making that crosshatch pattern, and then I'll glue those pieces on, and then this front facade will be done except for the hardware. Okay, so that turned out quite as I had hoped. I am very happy with that. There's a lot of tedious work putting together those window grills, but I think it looks really good. So the last thing that I need to do is put on the little door features. So I'm going to be using these brads because what I had bought in the hopes of using as a door handle is going to be too large. So there are these cute little ornate decorative rings, but it's about the same size as most of my doors, so it's going to be too big. It's going to look too big. So I have to decide which color of these brads to use. So some of them are black, And I like those the best because it matches those window grills. So I'm just going to use, I think, 1 for the doorknob and then 2 for hinges over towards the edge. So I'm going to need to very carefully punch some holes for those to go in. It's very sad to break something at this point because I'm almost done. For the hinge ones, I'm going to bend one leg of the brad outward. Now I'm not sure if I did the long one or the short one because they're different lengths. So for the doorknob, I can just bend it over in the back. And for the hinge ones, I'm just going to put a little spot of glue in the back to make sure they stay in the right place. The last step here involves fitting it into the tree base. I don't want to attach to the tree base yet because there's still finishing work to do on it, but I want to get the facade attached to the sour cream containers so that it travels as a unit. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of trimming to make it fit. Figuring out where exactly to trim is the tricky bit, though. I think I need to cut a notch up here for the root I have here. Of course, there's not much room to cut a notch. And I sort of just have to cut and hope that I've cut right. So that seems about right, and what I need to do now is trim the containers to match it. They already line up down here at this face, so I'm not going to mess with that at all. But I do want to take a little bit away from this top edge so that it can slide under the tree branch better. And I think just by sort of taking off that top little lip, that will solve the problem. I think it did. So now I can attach, at least at the bottom and up, about 1 inch on either side, and then these two things can travel as a unit. Alright, so there you have the front facade of the Tiny Fairy Bookstore built into the sour cream containers underneath the roots. And this concludes part 1, so if you'd like to see the rest of the project where I finish the tree, build out the structure around it, and finish the insides of the bookstore, then join us for part 2. Thanks for supporting Tickled Fancy Crafting by watching this video. Click the like button to let me know that you enjoyed the content, and subscribe to see new Tickled Fancy Crafting videos in your feed. If you'd like to be informed directly about the content, ring the notifications bell. Comment with crafts that you would like to see in the future, and remember, you can make this.